A millionaire tries to assault his wife in front of his entire family at a luxury restaurant. But outside, a humble man walks past, witnesses the scene, and, indignant, steps into the restaurant to do something that leaves everyone completely paralyzed. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The city's most luxurious restaurant radiated an almost suffocating sophistication. The dim lighting reflected off crystal glasses, polished silverware gleamed under the warm glow, and the hushed conversations of the elite blended with the soft notes of a live piano. Every detail, from the subtle floral scent to the flawless service, was designed to project perfection. But at the center of the dining room, amidst forced laughter and carefully constructed facades, a truth was on the verge of unraveling. Anderson Williams, a businessman known as much for his wealth as for his ruthless nature, commanded the table with his overpowering presence. His immaculate black suit, his gold watch, and his ever-confident smirk were as sharp as his words. Seated beside him, Sophie, his wife, wore a striking red dress, one he had chosen for her, accentuating her figure but unable to conceal the stiffness in her posture. Her eyes, hidden beneath a mask of expertly applied makeup, were empty, reflecting an exhaustion no amount of jewelry could disguise. The conversation revolved around Anderson's achievements, new investments, multi-million-dollar deals, luxury properties overseas. Every word he spoke was met with laughter and nods of agreement from his associates and family. Sophie, however, remained silent, idly pushing her food around her plate, not daring to interrupt. Anderson noticed her silence, and his smile tightened. "Sophie, dear," he began, his voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "Nothing to say? Ah, of course, I forget that finances aren't your strong suit. But tell me, do you at least know how much the wine you're drinking costs?" Laughter erupted around the table. Sophie felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her head down, swallowing the humiliation, just as she always did. Her cousin, Bethany, sitting across from her, attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere with a light-hearted joke, but one sharp glance from Anderson silenced her immediately. The air turned heavy, and though the piano continued playing, no one was really listening anymore. With trembling hands, Sophie lifted her wine glass, attempting to steady herself, but her fingers slipped, and deep red liquid spilled across the pristine white tablecloth. The stains spread rapidly, like a silent warning that everyone at the table watched in tense silence. Anderson said nothing at first. He merely observed her, his smirk still intact but his eyes cold. The silence stretched unbearably, each passing second a suffocating weight on Sophie's chest. Finally, he spoke, his voice deceptively calm but laced with venom. "You're so useless, you can't even hold a glass without ruining the evening." A few nervous chuckles broke the silence. Others simply looked away, uncomfortable. But no one spoke up. No one ever did. Sophie felt the ground beneath her shift, but she refused to let a single tear fall, not in front of him. As she reached for a napkin to clean the mess, she felt Anderson's hand slide beneath the table, gripping her thigh with crushing force. His fingers dug into her skin, making her gasp softly. All the while, his smirk remained, his demeanor unchanged. "Sit up straight, Sophie. Stop embarrassing yourself," he whispered, making sure only she could hear. But someone else was watching. Through the restaurant's grand windows, a man observed the scene. Jones Murphy, a former soldier with a hardened face and a piercing gaze, was passing by after a long shift at a community aid center. Something inside caught his attention. The forced laughter, the rigid posture of the woman in red, the wine spreading across the table like spilled blood. Jones recognized the scene, not because he knew Anderson or Sophie, but because he had seen that same expression of silent fear before, on his sister, Diana, years ago. Diana, who had suffered in silence until it was too late. He hadn't been able to save her then, but this time, he couldn't just walk away. Inside the restaurant, Sophie excused herself, her pulse pounding as she hurried to the restroom. In the mirror, she finally allowed a single tear to escape. She stared at her reflection, at the woman she barely recognized. The woman who had once been strong, full of dreams, now reduced to a mere shadow of herself. Meanwhile, outside, Jones made a decision. He crossed the street with purposeful strides. He pushed open the heavy doors of the restaurant, instantly drawing attention, though his focus remained locked on one man, Anderson Williams. When Sophie returned to the table, her eyes met Jones's across the room. He stood near the bar, watching the scene with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know who he was, but there was something different in his expression. Not pity, but resolve. Anderson noticed the stranger as well and frowned, annoyed by the intrusion, but he quickly dismissed it. No one challenged him. He was Anderson Williams, the untouchable. The dinner resumed, but the tension thickened. Anderson finally rose, signaling that it was time to leave, and grabbed Sophie's arm with more force than necessary. She didn't resist, but something was different this time. She no longer felt entirely alone. Just as they reached the exit, Jones stepped forward, blocking their path. The murmur of conversations hushed instantly. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward them. "Sir Williams," Jones said, his voice steady, "I think you need to learn how to treat your wife with respect." A deathly silence fell over the room. Anderson, stunned by the audacity, let out a sharp laugh, one devoid of humor. His smirk widened as he sized up Jones. "And who the hell do you think you are?" he sneered, his voice low and threatening. Jones didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on Anderson's, unwavering. "Just a man who refuses to stand by while you abuse someone who can't fight back." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sophie's heart pounded, but this time, not out of fear, out of something unfamiliar, hope. Anderson took a step forward, fury flashing across his face. But before he could speak, Sophie's voice, soft yet firm, cut through the air. "Leave it, Anderson. Let's go." For the first time in years, Anderson looked at her with surprise. There was something in her tone he hadn't heard before, defiance. Jones remained unmoving, an immovable force in the storm. Anderson, unwilling to risk further humiliation in public, released Sophie's arm and turned on his heel, storming out without another word. Sophie, her pulse still racing, looked at Jones. She said nothing, but her eyes were filled with unspoken gratitude and a silent question. "Who are you, and why do you care?" Jones held her gaze as she followed her husband out, his mind already working through what would come next. He didn't know exactly how, but he was determined to help her. As the restaurant doors closed behind them, Jones knew the real battle had just begun, and this time, he wouldn't lose. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. The night had wrapped the city in a deceptive calm. The restaurant's lights still shone like beacons of a world where perfection and power were mere masks concealing dark secrets. Jones stepped out onto the street, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with a restrained fury boiling inside him. Watching Sophie shrink under Anderson's grip had unearthed wounds he thought had long healed, memories of his sister Diana flashing through his mind like ghosts he could never exorcise. As he walked along the sidewalk, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from his colleague at the community center. "See you early tomorrow. We have a new family that needs help." Jones read it, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't just turn away and move on with his life. Not this time. The next morning, Sophie woke up to sunlight filtering through the curtains, its softness cruelly contrasting the weight pressing on her chest. Anderson was already gone, likely off to continue his life as a successful man, leaving behind only the echo of his venomous words and the invisible marks of his control. She rose slowly, her bare feet meeting the cold floor as her mind replayed the restaurant scene over and over. That man, the stranger who had stood between them. Who was he? Why had he done that? Across the city, Jones was digging for answers. He knew that confronting someone like Anderson Williams wasn't something he could do blindly. Using contact from the community center and old connections from his time in the military, he began tracing the businessman's steps. It didn't take long to uncover a network of rumors and hushed complaints buried beneath layers of power and influence. Employees fired without cause, questionable contracts, political donations that looked more like disguised bribes. But what truly made his blood run cold was an old post on a survivors forum. He doesn't just destroy businesses, he destroys lives. Sophie went through her day as usual, pretending nothing had changed, even though deep down, she knew something had. When she returned home, she found a gift box sitting on the dining table, wrapped with a perfectly tied red ribbon. With trembling hands, she untied it and lifted the lid. Inside lay a dazzling diamond necklace, its brilliance sharp under the dim lighting. Next to it, a note in Anderson's elegant handwriting. "So you remember who you are thanks to me." A gift, but also a chain. Meanwhile, Jones had driven to Sophie's neighborhood, watching from a distance. He had no clear plan, only the certainty that he needed to make sure she was okay. From his car, he saw her walk into her building, her slender frame moving with the grace of someone used to carrying an invisible burden. He wondered how many times she had made that same walk, trapped inside a gilded cage. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. The image of the man from the restaurant haunted her. His gaze hadn't been one of pity, but something deeper, as if he had seen what others refused to acknowledge. She rose from bed and walked to the window, staring at the city lights. Then she saw it. A dark car parked across the street, its lights off, yet she could feel someone watching. Her heartbeat quickened. Was it Anderson? Had he sensed that her resistance was growing? But it wasn't Anderson. Jones stepped out of the car, his instincts telling him he needed to act. He couldn't explain why, but he knew Sophie was standing on a fragile edge, and if someone didn't intervene soon, it might be too late. He crossed the street and, with a firm knock, rapped on the apartment door. Inside, Sophie froze at the sound, her mind filled with terrifying possibilities. Cautiously, she opened the door just a crack, her breath catching when she saw who was standing there. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jones said, keeping his hands visible so she wouldn't feel threatened. "I just saw what happened last night. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Sophie studied him with mistrust. She was used to appearances, to words that promised safety but turned into daggers. But there was something in his eyes, something familiar. A quiet rage, not directed at her, but it's something much larger. "I don't need your help," she said finally, closing the door before he could respond. Jones didn't insist. He knew wounds like Sophie's weren't healed with kind words or heroic gestures. Instead, he slipped a small card under the door before walking away. The message was simple: "When you're ready." Later that night, Sophie found the card. She held it between her fingers, feeling an unfamiliar mixture of fear and hope. She was trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, but for the first time in a long time, escape didn't seem so impossible. The next day, Anderson returned home early, a pleased smile on his lips and an expensive bottle of wine in hand. "How is my queen today?" he asked, his voice dripping with poisonous sweetness. Sophie forced a smile, though something inside her had cracked beyond repair. The card Jones had left remained hidden in her pocket, a silent reminder that freedom might be within reach, if she dared to take the first step. That evening, as they sat through an excruciatingly quiet dinner, Anderson casually mentioned something that made Sophie freeze. "I met someone interesting last night," he said, swirling his wine. "Some fool who didn't know who he was dealing with. I hope I don't see him again." His gaze locked onto hers, searching for a reaction. Sophie kept her composure, but inside, alarms blared. If Anderson saw Jones as a threat, that meant he was already in danger. But it also meant Jones was her only way out. Later that night, when Anderson fell asleep, Sophie took out the card. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number. The line rang once before Jones picked up. "I need your help," she whispered. Jones didn't hesitate. "I'm here," was all he said. Sophie glanced at her sleeping husband, her pulse hammering as determination bloomed inside her chest. She didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain: she was no longer alone. Sophie, still trembling from the call she had made to Jones the night before, moved through the house with mechanical motions. As always, Anderson left early, leaving behind the echo of his presence, heavy and suffocating. But this time, Sophie felt something different, a spark of hope tangled with fear. Jones, on the other hand, hadn't slept. His mind replayed the restaurant scene over and over, along with his brief conversation with Sophie. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but his instincts told him he had to help her, not just for her, but for his own need for redemption. That afternoon, Sophie and Anderson were invited to another dinner at the same restaurant where everything had begun. Anderson insisted on attending, as if he needed to reaffirm his power after the previous incident. Sophie didn't protest. She knew confronting him in public was risky, but it was also her only chance to show him that she was no longer alone. The restaurant was packed once again, the dim lighting and the constant murmur of elegant conversations creating the illusion of normalcy. Sophie sat beside Anderson, her face perfectly made up to conceal the tension beneath. Anderson, confident, spoke to his business partners as if nothing had happened, his laughter ringing through the room. Then, the restaurant doors opened and Jones walked in. A heavy silence fell over the space. Jones strode forward, his steps purposeful, his gaze locked onto Anderson. The moment Anderson saw him approach, his smile slowly faded, replaced by a sneer of disdain. "What are you doing here?" Anderson asked, his voice low but laced with menace. Jones didn't waver. "I just wanted to see how a man who hits his wife in public behaves when he doesn't have anyone to hide behind." A ripple of whispers spread through the restaurant. Eyes turned toward Anderson, scrutinizing him, waiting for his reaction. Sophie felt her heartbeat hammering in her chest. She could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Jones was confronting Anderson in front of everyone, something she had never thought possible. Anderson rose slowly, his imposing frame attempting to intimidate Jones. "I'll give you one chance to walk out of here before things get ugly." Jones didn't flinch. "I'm not going anywhere. But you, Anderson, you're going to stop hiding behind your money and your threats." The atmosphere in the restaurant was suffocating, as if everyone were holding their breath. Sophie looked at Jones, and for the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Anderson, losing control, raised his hand to strike Jones. But Jones caught his wrist effortlessly, gripping it firmly. His strength wasn't just physical. It was the unshakable resolve of a man who had seen too much pain to let it continue. "Is that all you've got?" Jones murmured, releasing Anderson with a look of disgust. Anderson, humiliated, glanced around, realizing that everyone was watching. His untouchable facade was beginning to crack, yet he wasn't the type of man to accept defeat easily. "This isn't over," Anderson whispered before storming out of the restaurant, his heavy steps echoing in the stunned silence he left behind. Jones turned to Sophie, who was still seated, frozen in shock. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded slowly, something shifting inside her. "Thank you," she murmured, but deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. That night, when Sophie returned home, she found a note taped to her door. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, and the words on the page made her blood turn to ice. "You know you can't hide. This isn't over." The threat was clear, but this time, Sophie wasn't alone. And soon, Anderson would realize that he no longer had control. Inside the Williams mansion, the atmosphere was thick, as if the walls themselves could feel the tension between Anderson and Sophie. After the incident at the restaurant, Anderson had been unusually calm, but Sophie knew that this calm was merely the silence before the storm. She had learned to recognize the signs. The way his eyes hardened, how his hands clenched into fists when he thought no one was watching. Anderson said nothing as they entered the house. He climbed the stairs and shut the door to his office with a sharp thud. Sophie remained downstairs in the living room, her heart pounding, but her mind clearer than ever before. She knew she had to act fast. She couldn't allow Anderson to regain control. She waited until she heard the sound of the shower running in the adjoining bathroom. This was her chance. Moving silently, she ascended the stairs, her steps muffled by the thick carpet. The office door was locked, but Anderson had left the key on his desk, too confident that Sophie would never dare to enter. He was wrong. She opened the door carefully and stepped inside. The office was a reflection of its owner, cold, meticulously organized, but with an underlying darkness that Sophie could now see clearly. She rummaged through the drawers, flipping through financial documents and contracts, until she found a black folder hidden beneath a false bottom. Her hands trembled as she opened it. What she saw made the ground beneath her feet vanish. Inside were not only offshore accounts and hidden transactions, but something even more chilling. Recently activated life insurance policy in her name, worth millions. But what truly made her blood run cold was an unsigned letter detailing plans for a domestic accident. The level of detail left no doubt. Anderson had no intention of ever letting her go. The sound of the water shutting off yanked her out of her trance. She quickly closed the folder and slipped it into her purse just as she heard Anderson's footsteps approaching. Sophie rushed downstairs, forcing herself to sit on the couch as if nothing had happened. Moments later, Anderson descended, a towel draped around his neck, his smile a thin mask of false charm. "I hope you've learned your lesson tonight," he said, his voice dripping with veiled menace. Sophie merely nodded, her expression blank, but inside, she was burning with resolve. The next day, while Anderson was at his company, Sophie met with Jones in a quiet cafe. She placed the documents on the table, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained what she had discovered. Jones listened in silence, his jaw clenched, fury evident in his eyes. "This is enough to destroy him," he finally said. "But we have to be careful. If he suspects anything, he might act first." Sophie nodded, knowing that every second mattered. However, when she returned home that evening, she knew something was wrong. The front door was slightly open, something that never happened in Anderson's perfectly controlled fortress. She stepped inside cautiously. The house was eerily quiet. On the dining table lay a note, written in Anderson's precise handwriting. "You're not as smart as you think. Your mother now belongs to me. One wrong move, and you'll never see her again." The air left her lungs. Her mother, Beatrice, was the only family she had left, the only person who had offered her comfort in her darkest moments. Anderson had crossed a line from which there was no return. But Sophie didn't break. She knew surrender wasn't an option. She contacted Jones immediately, her voice steady despite the fear tightening around her chest. "We have to act now. Not just for me, for her. I'm not going to let him win." Understanding that time was running out, Jones proposed a bold plan, exposing Anderson publicly in a setting where his power couldn't protect him. The perfect opportunity came in the form of a charity gala hosted by Anderson's company, where the city's elite and the media would be in attendance. On the night of the gala, Sophie wore the same dress she had worn at the dinner where it all began. But this time, she was no longer a prisoner. She was a warrior. Jones, working undercover as part of the security team, had all the evidence ready to be displayed on the event's main screen. As Anderson took the stage to deliver his speech, Sophie made her move. She walked to the center of the hall, her steps measured, her voice steady. "Before you start, Anderson, I think everyone here deserves to know who you really are." The lights dimmed, and the screen lit up with incriminating documents, bank statements, hidden accounts, recordings. Gasps of disbelief and whispers of horror spread through the room. Anderson struggled to maintain his composure, but his carefully crafted image was crumbling before everyone's eyes. When the police arrived, Anderson tried to flee, but Jones was waiting at the exit. "This is for Sophie," Jones said, his grip firm on Anderson's arm. "And for all the women who never got the chance to escape." Anderson was handcuffed and escorted out, his downfall playing out in front of the very people whose admiration he had craved. That night, as Sophie returned home, she found an envelope slipped under her door. She picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter. "This isn't over." The threat was clear, but Sophie was no longer the woman who had suffered in silence for years. She knew that while the battle against Anderson was over, the war for her freedom had only just begun. The night wrapped the city in a veil of shadows, but for Sophie, darkness was something she knew all too well. After Clara's betrayal and Anderson's threats, her mind was a storm of fear and determination. She couldn't afford to fail. This time, it wasn't just about her. Her mother, Beatrice, was in danger, and she wouldn't let Anderson take away the only family she had left. Jones became her only lifeline. After receiving Sophie's message, he started connecting the dots. Anderson wasn't just a violent man. He was a criminal with a corruption network stretching far beyond what most could imagine. With the help of his contacts in the police and former military colleagues, Jones uncovered documents linking Anderson to money laundering, suspicious disappearances, and bribing judges and officers. He was a man who had built his empire on the suffering of others. Meanwhile, Sophie played her own game, pretending everything was normal. Anderson, aware that something felt off, began watching her more closely. Every word, every gesture was calculated to avoid suspicion, but inside, her fury grew. She knew she had to act fast before Anderson made the first move. The opportunity came in the form of an annual charity gala, a staged event that Anderson used to maintain his public image. Sophie knew this would be the perfect stage to expose him. With Jones's help and with Samantha, one of Anderson's former employees who had been unjustly fired, they gathered enough evidence to bring him down. Samantha, still haunted by fear but strengthened by purpose, revealed something even more chilling. Anderson had hired a hitman, Charlie, to get rid of Sophie. "He doesn't leave loose ends," Samantha whispered, trembling. "He's done this before." The plan was clear: expose Anderson in front of the city's elite, where neither his money nor his influence could protect him. But nothing in Sophie's life had ever been easy. That night, she returned home to find a letter slipped under the door. "If you try anything, your mother will pay the price." Next to the note was a recent photo of Beatrice, taken without her knowledge. The threat was real. Sophie's hands trembled, but she refused to give in to fear. The next day, she met with Jones. "I can't risk it," she said, her voice breaking. "If something happens to my mother—" Jones cut her off, his voice firm. "We won't let that happen. Trust me." The night of the gala arrived sooner than expected. Sophie wore an elegant red dress, the same color Anderson always said looked good on her, but this time, it wasn't for his approval. It was a statement, a symbol of her rebirth. Jones, disguised as part of the security team, carried the evidence. Samantha, hidden in the background, watched everything unfold, ready to act if anything went wrong. The grand hall was packed with powerful figures: businessmen, politicians, journalists. Anderson took the stage with his usual confident smile, ready to deliver his speech. But before he could utter the first word, Sophie stood up from her seat in the center of the room. "Before you continue, Anderson," her voice cut through the murmurs, "I think everyone here deserves to know who you really are." The lights flickered, and suddenly, the giant screens displayed documents, recordings, and testimonies. The audience was frozen in shock. The evidence was undeniable: bribes, threats, money laundering, and his involvement in multiple disappearances, including that of his first wife, which had been covered up as an accident. The room filled with gasps of horror and disgust. Anderson's confident mask crumbled. "This is a lie," he roared, but his voice reeked of desperation. He tried to step down from the stage, but Jones blocked his path at the exit. "It's over, Anderson," Jones said, his voice low but unshakable. "You can't run from this." At that moment, the police stormed into the venue, placing handcuffs around Anderson's wrists. Even as they restrained him, he turned to Sophie with pure hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat. But Sophie, calmer than she had been in years, met his gaze and replied, "For you, it is." As the crowd whispered and cameras flashed, Jones approached Sophie. "We did it," he murmured. But Sophie felt a strange unease. Later that night, when she arrived home, she found another letter waiting for her. "This isn't over. See you soon." The threat was clear. But Sophie was no longer the woman who had once lived in silence and fear. She knew that while the battle against Anderson was over, the real enemy was still out there, watching, waiting. And this time, she would be ready. The city was slowly waking up, but for Sophie, the night was far from over. After Anderson's public humiliation and arrest, a lingering shadow loomed over her. The anonymous letter she found upon returning home, with the ominous warning, "This isn't over. See you soon," weighed heavily on her mind like a silent threat. She knew that Anderson had both enemies and allies lurking in the shadows, and the real battle was just beginning. Jones, on the other hand, couldn't ignore the photograph he had found in the pocket of the hitman Charlie. The image showed his sister, Diana, alive, but in an unknown location. The revelation shook him to his core. How was Anderson connected to his sister's disappearance? And what did this all mean now that Anderson was behind bars? Both of them knew that the only way to find answers was to follow the trail of money and Anderson's connections. Jones used his contacts in the police to gain access to Anderson's financial records, uncovering a network of offshore accounts and transactions leading to an organization far bigger than they had imagined. But the most disturbing revelation was the name that kept appearing in several of those transactions: Gabriel Williams, Anderson's younger brother. Gabriel had always been a distant figure in Anderson's life, known for his apparent disinterest in the family business. However, the evidence suggested otherwise. Gabriel wasn't just involved. He was the mastermind behind many of Anderson's illegal operations. And now, with Anderson out of the way, Gabriel was ready to take control. The final confrontation was inevitable. Sophie and Jones knew they couldn't take on Gabriel the same way they had taken down Anderson. Gabriel was more calculated, more careful. He wouldn't leave any loose ends. They needed a plan, one that would not only expose his crimes, but strip him of his power and leave him with no way to retaliate. The opportunity came in the form of an unexpected invitation. Gabriel was hosting an exclusive charity gala at the Williams mansion, an event designed to show his commitment to the community and restore the family's reputation after Anderson's scandal. Sophie and Jones knew this was their only chance. On the night of the gala, Sophie walked into the mansion with her head held high, her unexpected presence causing murmurs among the guests. Gabriel, upon seeing her, smirked with the same arrogance she had seen in Anderson. But there was something else in his gaze, a flicker of recognition and suspicion. "Sophie," Gabriel greeted, approaching her with a champagne glass in hand. "I didn't expect to see you here. After everything that happened, I assumed you'd prefer to keep your distance from the Williams family." Sophie remained composed. "I just came to see how the Williams family moves forward after all that's happened." Gabriel chuckled, but his eyes stayed cold. "We always know how to recover. Family is strong." From across the room, Jones watched the exchange carefully. He knew the decisive moment was near. While Sophie kept Gabriel occupied, Jones slipped away toward Gabriel's private office, hoping to find the final pieces of evidence they needed. Inside the office, Jones found what he was looking for: documents linking Gabriel to Diana's disappearance and other crimes that would make any public defense impossible. But before he could leave, Gabriel appeared in the doorway, a gun in hand and a venomous smile on his lips. "I knew something felt off," Gabriel said, aiming the weapon at Jones. "You're as predictable as your sister." Sophie, having noticed Gabriel's absence, had silently followed him. Without hesitation, she grabbed a heavy candlestick from the nearby table and struck him across the head. Gabriel collapsed to the ground, unconscious. With the evidence in hand, Sophie and Jones left the mansion and went straight to the police station. They handed over everything they had gathered, and by dawn, Gabriel Williams was arrested on multiple charges, including kidnapping and human trafficking. The news spread quickly, and the once untouchable Williams family fell into disgrace. But for Jones, the story wasn't over yet. Weeks later, he received an unmarked letter. Inside was a photograph of Diana, alive, in what appeared to be a small coastal town. The letter contained only 3 words: "Come find me." As Jones packed his things to begin the search for his sister, Sophie finally felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmare was over, but she knew the journey to healing was only just beginning. She had broken free from Anderson and Gabriel's chains, and now, for the first time, she was the master of her own destiny. The sun shone brightly over the city as Sophie and Jones walked toward the future, leaving behind the pain, but never forgetting the lessons they had learned. Justice had been served, but the true victory was the freedom they had won for themselves. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.